The drive to the bank felt like a blur. Inside that small, cold viewing room, I found the truth Sarah had tried to hide. A USB drive and a letter that turned my world upside down. Sarah hadn't just been sick. She had been living with two snakes under our roof. I didn't go home. I couldn't. I went to a local Starbucks, bought a cheap laptop, and watched my life get ripped apart digitally. Greg and Emily had stolen nearly $200,000, but that wasn't even the end game. They were trying to have me declared incompetent, legal dementia, according to the fake medical files Greg had forged. They wanted the house, the business, all of it. I sat there, 48 years old, and felt a cold, sharp rage I hadn't felt in years. I knew I needed professional help. I called an old friend, Frank. He's a guy from my early construction days who traded his hammer for a private investigator's license. When Frank picked up, I didn't waste any time with small talk. I told him straight out that I had a couple of vultures in my house, and I needed his help to set a trap. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Frank's voice got real low, real serious. He asked me if I was sure about going after my own blood. I looked out at the gray, foggy lake and told him exactly what I felt. I told him they weren't my blood anymore. To me, they were just pests, and it was time for an extermination. Frank didn't ask any more questions. He just told me he was in. I drove back to the house that evening, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had to be perfect. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw Emily standing on the porch, wearing one of my late wife's sweaters. Seeing her in Sarah's clothes usually made me feel comforted, but now, it made me want to vomit. She gave me that bright, fake smile and told me I was late for dinner. I knew this was the moment. I had to start the act. I stumbled a little as I got out of the truck, letting my keys clatter onto the pavement. I kept my eyes unfocused, a little vacant. When she asked if I was okay, I told her I'd gotten lost on the way back from the hardware store, that I couldn't remember which turn was ours. I saw it then, just for a split second, a flash of pure, predatory joy in her eyes before she masked it with concern. She rushed down the steps, grabbing my arm and calling out for Greg. She told him I'd had another one of my episodes. As they led me into the house, I realized the game had officially begun. They thought they were leading an old man to his room. They didn't realize they were walking straight into a cage. Dinner that night was a masterclass in deception. Emily had laid out a spread of pot roast and mashed potatoes, acting like the doting sister. I sat there, picking at my food, making sure to drop my fork a few times and stare blankly at the wall. I could feel Greg watching me from across the table, his eyes narrowing, calculating how much longer he'd have to wait. I asked Emily where Sarah was. I made sure my voice sounded small, like a man lost in a fog. Emily froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. She looked at Greg, a silent communication passing between them that said, "It's happening faster than we thought." She reached over, patting my hand, and reminded me in a sugary sweet voice that Sarah had been gone for 2 years. I let a single tear roll down my cheek, nodded slowly, and apologized, saying the fog just gets so thick sometimes. Inside, I was screaming. I wanted to flip the table and kick them out into the Tahoe cold right then, but I needed more. I needed them to feel safe enough to talk. The next day, while Greg and Emily went into town, likely to consult with their crooked lawyer about my supposed decline, Frank and his team arrived. They didn't look like tech guys, they looked like a cleaning crew. In 3 hours, my house was transformed. Tiny pinhole cameras were tucked into the crown molding of the living room, the kitchen, and my office. High-gain microphones were hidden in the lamps and under the dining table. Frank handed me an encrypted tablet before he left. He told me that I could watch and listen to everything from a hidden partition on my own computer. He also gave me a small vial of clear liquid. It wasn't poison. It was a heavy-duty sedative. He suggested that if I ever felt they were getting physically aggressive, I should know how to defend myself. I tucked it into the back of my desk drawer, hoping I wouldn't need it. That night I sat in my darkened study, headphones on, watching the live feed. Emily and Greg were in the kitchen, sharing a bottle of my expensive Napa Cabernet. Their masks were off. Greg was pacing, complaining about a guy named Vinny. Apparently, Greg's Reno gambling debts hadn't stayed in Reno. He owed $80,000 to some local collectors, and they weren't the type to accept an installment plan. He told Emily that they needed to move the competency hearing up. He said the doctor he'd bribed, a disgraced GP from Carson City, was ready to sign the papers as soon as they had one more documented outburst from me. Then Emily said something that made my stomach turn. She suggested that once they had the power of attorney signed, they didn't even need to wait for a facility. She talked about the medication I was taking for my heart. She said if I accidentally took a double or triple dose during a period of confusion, no one would question it. They'd just call it a tragic end to a declining life. I gripped the edge of my desk so hard my knuckles turned white. My own sister was discussing my accidental death over a glass of wine. I realized then that this wasn't just about money anymore. This was a survival operation. The next few days, I turned up the heat. I started hallucinating. I'd stand in the backyard at 2 a.m., staring at the woods, calling out Sarah's name. I'd see them watching me from the windows, filming me on their phones. Every clip they took was more evidence for their court case, but every second of their filming was being recorded by Frank's high-def cameras, including their whispered celebrations behind the camera. On Thursday, Greg approached me in the garage. He had a stack of papers in his hand. He told me it was just some insurance renewals for the construction company. He said I needed to sign them so the workers could stay on the job. He was leaning in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and desperation. I looked at the papers. It wasn't insurance. It was a limited power of attorney giving Greg the right to sell business assets in the event of my incapacity. I looked at him, letting my hand shake. I asked him if he was sure this was right. He smiled, the kind of smile a wolf gives a wounded deer, and told me he'd take care of everything. I signed it, but I didn't sign Mark Henderson. I signed Sarah Henderson in a messy, scrawled hand. Greg didn't even check the signature. He snatched the paper away, his eyes gleaming. He told me I'd done the right thing and that I should go inside and take a nap. As soon as he left, I messaged Frank. I told him Greg had the bait. Now, we just had to wait for the sharks to bite. Later that evening, the surveillance picked up Greg on the phone in the driveway. He was talking to Vinny. He told the guy he'd have the first $20,000 by Monday. He said he was liquidating some equipment from the firm. What Greg didn't know was that the limited power of attorney he held was legally worthless because of the signature. But more importantly, I had already contacted my foreman at the construction yard. I told him that if anyone showed up trying to move a crane or a bulldozer, they were to call the police immediately for grand theft. The trap was set. Greg was about to try and sell equipment he didn't own, using a forged document I'd tricked him into taking. But I wasn't done. I wanted Emily too. I wanted her to show the world exactly how much she loved her brother. I went into the kitchen where she was preparing tea. I told her I'd had a moment of clarity. I told her I was thinking about changing my will to leave everything to a charity for Sarah's favorite park instead of the family. I said I felt like I shouldn't burden her with the money. The look on her face was pure horror. She tried to hide it, telling me that we should talk about it later, but I could see her mind racing. She was terrified the golden goose was about to fly away before they could pluck it. That night the microphones caught her and Greg in a heated argument. Emily was screaming that they had to act now. She said they couldn't wait for the court hearing. They had to get the cognitive assessment done tomorrow by any means necessary. I sat back in my chair watching the screen. Tomorrow was Friday, the day they planned to strip me of my life. I pulled out my phone and sent one last text to Frank and my lawyer. Tomorrow morning, the 10 a.m. meeting, have the deputies ready. I looked at the framed photo of Sarah on my desk. I told her silently that I was almost there, that the people who had tried to turn her memory into a weapon were about to find out exactly what happens when you push a Henderson too far. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, watching the Tahoe moon, waiting for the sun to rise on the last day Greg and Emily would ever spend in my house. Friday morning arrived with a biting Lake Tahoe wind that rattled the window panes of my study. I watched from the second floor as a rusted silver sedan pulled into my driveway. Out stepped a man who looked less like a doctor and more like a guy you'd find betting on dog fights in a back alley. This was Dr. Aris Thorne, the expert Greg had hired to sign my life away. I took a deep breath, adjusted my flannel shirt, and went downstairs. I had to be the perfect victim one last time. Emily greeted the doctor with a performance that deserved an Oscar. She was dabbing at her eyes, whispering about how difficult it had been to watch her big brother lose his mind. Greg was standing by the fireplace, looking smug, already mentally spending the money from the equipment he thought he was about to sell. When they introduced me to Thorne, I played the part. I stared at him for a few seconds too long, then asked if he was the guy here to fix the water heater. I saw Thorne exchange a look with Greg, a look that said, "This is going to be the easiest paycheck of my life." We sat in the living room. Thorne started asking me basic questions: what day it was, who the president was, where I lived. I purposely got half of them wrong. I told him it was 1998 and that I was pretty sure we were in Colorado. Every time I gave a wrong answer, I could see Emily's chest swell with excitement. She was practically vibrating. Then Thorne pulled out a thick document. He told me it was just a medical consent form that would allow him to share his findings with my loving caregivers. I knew exactly what it was, a permanent waiver of my patient rights, giving Emily full access to my medical history and the power to commit me to a psychiatric ward without a second hearing. I picked up the pen, my hand shaking, partly as an act, but partly from the pure adrenaline of being in a room with 3 people who were actively trying to bury me alive. Just as I was about to put the pen to paper, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was the prearranged signal from Frank. Greg's attempt to sell my business equipment was happening right now. I stood up abruptly, knocking over my water glass. I apologized profusely, acting confused, and told them I needed to get a towel from the kitchen. Emily tried to stop me, telling me to just sign the paper first, but I brushed past her, muttering about the mess. Once I was in the kitchen, I pulled out my phone. Frank had sent me a live link to the security feed at my construction yard. I saw Greg standing next to a flatbed truck and a guy I didn't recognize, likely a shady buyer he'd found on the black market. Greg was holding the forged power of attorney, pointing at a 3-year-old Caterpillar excavator worth $150,000. I watched as my foreman, Joe, walked out of the office. Joe is 6'4" and built like a brick wall. He'd worked for me for 20 years. Following my instructions, Joe didn't shout. He just asked Greg for the paperwork. When Greg handed him the document with Sarah Henderson scrawled at the bottom, Joe didn't even blink. He just pulled out his phone and dialed the police. I saw the color drain from Greg's face on that tiny screen. He started arguing, waving his arms, trying to grab the keys to the excavator. But then, 2 Washoe County Sheriff cruisers pulled into the yard, blocking the exit. The trap at the yard had sprung. Greg was being detained for questioning on grand theft and fraud. But I still had 2 vultures in my living room. I walked back into the room empty-handed. I told Emily and the doctor that I couldn't find the towels because the kitchen had moved. Emily was losing her patience. She grabbed the pen and shoved the paper toward me, her voice losing its sweet edge. She told me to just sign it so they could help me. I looked at Thorne. I asked him, straight out, how much Greg was paying him to sign a false competency report. The room went dead silent. Thorne's eyes went wide. Emily let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh, asking me what on earth I was talking about. I sat down, my back straight, the fog completely gone from my eyes. I told Thorne that I knew about his suspended medical license in Arizona. I told him I knew about the $5,000 Greg had wired him from my own business account. And then I pointed to the crown molding. I told them about the cameras. I told them that everything they had said in this house for the last week, the talk of triple dosing my medication, the gambling debts, the plan to lock me away, was currently sitting on a secure server at a private investigator's office. Thorne didn't even say goodbye. He grabbed his bag and bolted for the door. Emily tried to grab his arm, screaming for him to stay, but he shook her off and sped out of the driveway like his life depended on it. Emily turned back to me, her face contorted in a way I'd never seen before. The mask was gone. She wasn't my sister anymore. She was a cornered animal. She started screaming that I was the one who was sick, that I was hallucinating cameras, that no one would believe an insane old man over her. That was when she reached for the teapot she'd brought in earlier. She poured a cup, her hands trembling, and told me I just needed to calm down. She said, "Drink your tea, Mark. Just drink the tea and we can forget all of this." I looked at the tea. I knew about the sedative Frank had warned me about. I knew she was desperate enough to try and knock me out before the police arrived. I stood up and walked over to her. I took the cup from her hand. I looked her right in the eyes and told her that I'd loved her, that Sarah had loved her. I asked her if $180,000 was really worth more than her own brother's life. For a second, just a second, I saw a flash of regret, but then her eyes went cold again. She told me I had everything and she had nothing, and that it wasn't fair. I poured the tea into the potted fern next to the sofa and set the cup down. I told her the police were already at the construction yard with Greg. I told her they'd be here in 10 minutes. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She just sat down on the sofa, buried her face in her hands, and started laughing. It was a cold, broken sound that echoed through the house Sarah and I had built. I walked out onto the porch and sat on the steps. The Tahoe wind was still blowing, but I didn't feel the cold anymore. I felt a strange sense of peace. The house was quiet. The snakes were caught. But as I sat there watching the road for the sirens, I realized something. Greg was caught for theft. Thorne had fled. But Emily had been careful. She hadn't signed the forged POA. She hadn't been at the yard. All I had was audio of her talking. In a court of law, she might still slip away. I realized I needed one more thing. I needed her to actually do something that left no room for doubt. I heard the back door of the house open. I didn't turn around. I just waited. I knew what Emily was capable of when she was backed into a corner, and I knew she wasn't done with me yet. I sat there on the porch steps, my back to the front door, listening to the sound of my sister's world collapsing. I knew she was in the house, pacing like a caged animal. I could hear drawers being slammed, glass shattering. She was looking for the server. She thought if she could find the recordings and destroy them, she could still walk away as the victim of a confused older brother. What she didn't realize was that there was no server in the house. Everything was being live-streamed to a secure cloud and monitored in real time by Frank and his team. After a few minutes, the noise inside stopped. The silence was worse than the crashing. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't turn around, but I felt the screen door creak open. Emily's voice came from behind me. It wasn't the voice of the sister I grew up with. It was cold, hollow, and filled with a desperate kind of venom. She told me that I was a fool. She said that even if I had recordings, no court in Nevada would take the word of a man who'd been documented as losing his mind for the last 6 months. She reminded me that Greg had those forged medical files and that she had witnesses, the neighbors, our friends at the club, who had seen my outbursts. I finally turned my head to look at her. She was standing there holding a heavy brass lamp she'd ripped from the side table. Her knuckles were white. I realized then that she wasn't just looking to destroy evidence anymore. She was looking to finish what she and Greg had started. I stood up slowly, keeping my hands visible. I told her that those witnesses had only seen what she wanted them to see. I told her that I'd already spoken to our neighbors, the Millers, and explained the prank we were playing for a reality show. They'd been in on the act for 3 days. They knew I was fine. The lamp in her hand wavered. The realization that her social evidence was gone started to sink in. But then she smiled. It was the most disturbing thing I'd ever seen. She told me that it didn't matter. She said if I fell off this porch and hit my head, or if the house accidentally caught fire while I was in a sedated sleep, her legal guardianship would kick in immediately based on the papers Dr. Thorne had already signed. She took a step toward me, the lamp raised. She told me that I was always the golden child, the one Sarah loved most, the one who got the business while she was left with nothing. The resentment she'd been carrying for 40 years was finally pouring out. But I wasn't scared. I was just tired. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and showed her the screen. It wasn't a video of her. It was a GPS tracker. I told her that the Washoe County deputies weren't 10 minutes away. I told her they were at the bottom of the driveway. That was when the first siren wailed, echoing off the mountain peaks. Emily's face transformed. The rage turned into pure, unadulterated panic. She dropped the lamp, it shattered on the porch, and she bolted. She didn't run for the driveway. She ran for the back of the house, toward the woods. She thought she could disappear into the Tahoe wilderness. I didn't chase her. I didn't have to. 10 seconds later, the sheriff's cruisers swerved into the gravel driveway, lights flashing red and blue against the dark pines. Frank was in the lead car. He jumped out before the vehicle had even fully stopped, his hand on his holster, shouting for everyone to stay exactly where they were. I stood there, my hands on the porch railing as the deputies flooded the house. I heard them shouting clear, in room after room. One deputy stayed with me, asking if I was injured, if I needed a medic. I just shook my head and pointed toward the back trail. I told them my sister was heading for the ravine. It took them 20 minutes to find her. She hadn't made it far. She'd tripped in the dark, caught her foot in some low brush, and was screaming at the deputies that I'd tried to kill her. Even with the handcuffs on, she was still trying to spin the narrative. She was shouting that I'd lured her out there, that I was insane, that she was the one who needed protection. I watched from the driveway as they led her out of the woods. Her clothes were torn, her hair was a mess, and the mask of the loving sister was gone forever. As they walked her past me toward the cruiser, she stopped. She looked at me with so much hatred I felt it in my bones. She told me she wished I'd died with Sarah. I didn't say anything. I just watched the deputy put his hand on her head and guide her into the back seat. Frank walked over to me, wiping sweat from his forehead. He told me that they'd picked up Greg at the construction yard. Greg hadn't even made it to the station before he started talking. He'd flipped on Emily in exchange for a lighter sentence. He told the cops everything: the forged medical records, the doctor's bribe, the gambling debts, and Emily's idea to over-medicate me. The long con was over. But as the tail lights of the cruisers disappeared down the mountain road, the silence that returned to the house felt different. It wasn't the heavy, grieving silence I'd lived with since Sarah died. It was a clean silence, like the air after a massive storm. I walked back into the living room. It was a mess: the shattered lamp, the overturned chair, the spilled tea. I looked at the spot where Emily had stood, trying to steal my life. I realized that for 2 years I'd been letting her and Greg use my grief as a doorway. I'd been so focused on what I'd lost that I'd almost lost myself. I picked up the framed photo of Sarah that Emily had knocked over. The glass was cracked, but Sarah was still smiling. I realized that the best way to honor her wasn't by being a victim. It was by being the man she'd married, the man who knew how to build things and, more importantly, how to protect them. Frank stayed with me that night. We sat on the porch, not saying much, just watching the stars over Lake Tahoe. He told me the legal battle ahead would be long. Emily would fight, Greg would plea, and the lawyers would get their cut. but the outcome was certain. They were going away for a long time. I looked at Frank and told him that the money they'd stolen, the $180,000, I didn't want it back. I told him I wanted it to go to a fund for elderly victims of financial abuse. I wanted something good to come out of the rot they'd brought into my home. I went to bed that night in my own room, in my own house, for the first time in 18 months, without the feeling that someone was watching me from the shadows. But the story wasn't quite over. On Monday morning, my lawyer called. He had some news from the county jail. It turned out that Dr. Thorne hadn't just fled. He'd been picked up trying to cross the border into California. And he had something in his briefcase that neither Greg nor Emily knew about. He had a second set of medical records, the real ones, and what they revealed about my sister's plans went far deeper than just financial fraud. Monday morning in my lawyer's office was the coldest I'd ever felt. My attorney, Steve, sat across from me with a thick folder and a look of grim satisfaction. He told me that Dr. Thorne had flipped within an hour of being caught. The man was a coward, but he was a meticulous one. He had kept a black file on every illegal client he'd ever worked for, insurance for himself in case things went south. But what he had on Emily was worse than anything I could have imagined. Steve slid a lab report across the desk. He explained that Emily hadn't just been forging my medical records to make me look like I had dementia. According to the notes Thorne had kept, Emily had been asking him for specific advice on chemical cognitive interference. The blood tests Thorne had performed on me months ago, under the guise of a routine checkup, showed traces of heavy metals and high-dose sedatives that I'd never been prescribed. Emily hadn't been waiting for me to decline. She had been actively poisoning me, slipping small amounts into my favorite pot roast and the tea she made me every night. The fog I'd been feeling wasn't just grief, it was her. I sat there in that plush leather chair and felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to grip the armrests. My own sister hadn't just been greedy, she'd been a slow-motion executioner. She sat across from me for 18 months, smiling and dabbing her eyes, while she slowly erased my brain. Steve told me that with this evidence, the charges were being upgraded. It wasn't just fraud and grand theft anymore. It was attempted premeditated murder. The trial happened 6 months later. I didn't want to go, but Steve insisted I stand there and look them in the eyes. Greg went first. He looked like a shell of a man, his expensive suit hanging off his frame. He'd taken a plea deal, testifying against Emily in exchange for 15 years. He cried on the stand, blaming his gambling debts, his weakness, and eventually my sister. He said she was the architect and he was just the contractor. Then came Emily. She didn't cry. She sat at the defense table with her back straight, looking at me with a cold, haughty disdain. Her lawyer tried to argue that she was overwhelmed by my care and had made tragic mistakes in judgment. But then Frank's recordings were played. The entire courtroom heard her voice, cold and clinical, discussing the dosage needed to make my heart stop. They heard her laughing about how easy it was to manipulate me. They heard the sound of her shattering that brass lamp on the porch when she thought her plan was failing. When the judge handed down the sentence, he didn't hold back. He called her a predator who had weaponized the sacred bond of family. He sentenced her to life with the possibility of parole only after 40 years. At her age, it was a death sentence. As the bailiffs led her out, I didn't feel the triumph I thought I would. I just felt a profound sense of waste. I went back to Tahoe and got to work. I sold the house. I couldn't walk into that kitchen without thinking about the poison in the tea. I couldn't sit on that porch without hearing the sirens. I bought a smaller, modern place on the north side of the lake, a place Sarah and I had never visited, a fresh start. I kept Henderson custom builds, but I made some changes. I took the $180,000 Greg and Emily had stolen, which the court had recovered from their secret accounts, and I didn't keep a dime of it. I founded the Henderson Webb Justice Fund. We partnered with local law enforcement and social workers to provide free private investigators and legal counsel for seniors being targeted by predatory relatives. I realized that my story wasn't unique. In this country, thousands of people are discarded by the people who are supposed to love them most, all for the sake of a bank account or a piece of property. I wanted to make sure that the next Mark Henderson had a Frank in his corner. My foreman, Joe, and the rest of my crew stayed with me through the whole mess. They're my real family now. We spend our days building things that are meant to last, cabins that will stand for 100 years, houses where families will actually love each other. It's been a year now since the extermination ended. I'm 49. My hair is a little whiter, and I still have days where the fog of grief for Sarah rolls in, but it's a natural fog now. It's not the chemical darkness Emily tried to force on me. Every Saturday morning I take my boat out to the middle of Lake Tahoe. I sit there in the silence, watching the sun hit the snow-capped peaks, and I talk to Sarah. I tell her about the business. I tell her about the fund. I tell her that I'm finally living for both of us. I've learned that you can't choose your blood, but you can damn sure choose who you let into your home. I've learned that trust is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used to build or it can be used to destroy. Most importantly, I've learned that I'm still standing. They tried to steal my mind, my money, and my life. But at the end of the day, I'm the one watching the sunrise. I'm the one with the tools in my hand. The snakes are in their cages, and the house is finally clean. I pulled my boat back into the dock today and saw a young woman waiting for me. She's an architect I hired to help with our new project, a community center for the elderly. She asked me why I do so much pro bono work for the seniors in town. I just smiled, looked at the clear blue water, and told her it was simple. I told her that in this life, the most important thing you can build isn't a house. It's a defense, and I'm just making sure the foundation is solid. I walked toward my truck, the keys jangling in my pocket. They were the keys to a new life, a new business, and a new purpose. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't look back.